Thank you so much for joining us for the 9th We Were There. It's on Not Everything is Better with Butter Flavoring, Popcorn Lung Disease, and the Dangers of Diacetyl. This is a fascinating story of phenomenal epi work with a little bit of luck about the location and a lot of fantastic lab work to back up the story. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ann Schuckett, the Deputy Director for CDC. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Phoebe, and welcome everybody to today's installment of We Were There. There's probably no symptom more concerning than the difficulty breathing. Probably one of the most memorable experiences I had as an intern, newly in the hospital on my first night on call in internal medicine, was going into the intensive care unit to follow a patient who was fighting for life, very, very difficult to ventilate. Today, he would be waiting for a lung transplant, but in that evening, my job was just to try to keep him alive through the night. As I was looking at the background for today's installment, I realized that even that individual could have potentially gotten that devastating disease through his job. I think we take for granted that our jobs don't make us sick, but as we learned the mystery that was uncovered in the sleuthing that was done on this front, we realize that even today there are potential work-related serious conditions. I don't want to go through the story because it's a very good one, but in this cold weather where everybody's huddling with their Netflix stream and eating their popcorn, this is a kind of a cautionary tale. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our fabulous lineup of all women speakers today, and welcome to We Were There.
Thank you, Dr. Schuckett. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kathleen Kress, our first speaker and disease detective.
Thank you. Thank you, Phoebe. Our story is how we discovered that diacetyl, which is the principal component of butter flavoring, is not safe to breathe, despite the Food and Drug Administration's assurance that it's safe to eat. The backstory is instructive. In 1999, a 51-year-old worker at a Missouri microwave popcorn plant developed disabling skin disease, and his fissured, bleeding hands and feet precluded him from working. He lost a workers' compensation claim for occupational skin disease, at which point he acknowledged that he couldn't breathe either. His wife knew of 4 of her husband's former co-workers who had respiratory difficulties, and she suspected that the cause of their disease was occupational. She gave names and contact information to her lawyer's son. The lawyer had no experience with work-related claims, and he passed the information to a workers' compensation lawyer in Kansas City, 2 hours away. By interviewing the 5 former workers with lung problems, he found 3 more workers with lung complaints and passed medical records for the 8 former workers to an occupational medicine physician. The 8 former workers reported cough and progressive shortness of breath with any exertion. They had developed symptoms at ages 27 to 51, which was much earlier than customary for smokers at risk of emphysema, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. In any case, 5 of the 8 had never smoked or had smoked very little. Their respiratory problems dated from 1992 to 2000 with no common accidental exposure at work. Their symptoms started 5 months to 9 years into their employment at the microwave popcorn plant. None of them thought that they had a work-related cause of disease because they had no pattern of symptoms being worse at work, or better on vacation, or better after leaving work because of their respiratory disability. The occupational physician, Dr. Alan Parmet, noted that 4 of the 8 former workers were listed for lung transplant, which was unusual coming from a small rural community in southwest Missouri who shared a common last employment at a microwave popcorn plant. Although they had a variety of diagnoses, asthma, emphysema, bronchitis, their difficulty getting air out of their lungs and no response to asthma medications was suggestive of bronchiolitis obliterans. Medical textbooks describe bronchiolitis obliterans, or BO, as a rare lung disease. Workers with BO have a single overwhelming exposure to a lung toxin such as nitrogen oxides in silos. If they survive this respiratory emergency, they seem to recover completely. Then, several weeks later, they develop difficulty blowing air out of their lungs. That is obstruction to airflow. No medications help their breathing difficulties, unlike asthma and chronic obstructive lung disease. And for that reason, lung transplant appears to be the only option when their obstruction on breathing tests is bad enough. Chest x-rays and diffusing capacity, which reflects the lung's ability to transfer gases, are not helpful in diagnosis. None of the 8 popcorn plants cases reported such a textbook history. But Dr. Parmet knew the cases didn't have asthma or smoking-related lung disease. He reported the cluster of suspected bronchiolitis obliterans to a sanitarian at the Missouri Department of Health and Social Services, and that sanitarian called CDC in May of 2000. CDC referred the report to Hector Ortega, EIS officer in the Division of Respiratory Disease Studies in Morgantown, West Virginia at the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. We told the sanitarian to obtain the medical records to confirm the diagnoses. Dr. Ortega and I called back to the sanitarian at the Missouri Health Department every month to check on the medical records findings, which never surfaced. We eventually contacted the new state epidemiologist, Dr. Eduardo Simoas, and within 3 days, he had reviewed the records and requested our assistance in investigating under the state's authority. Spirometry, a type of breathing test, can document normal and abnormal patterns, but can't differentiate among diagnoses. A person with healthy lungs can take a deep breath and blast it out quickly, as indicated in the normal scarlet slide, line in the slide. Persons with emphysema, asthma, or bronchiolitis obliterans have difficulty blowing out rapidly, as shown in the 2 curves to your left. They have obstruction to airflow, which results in a scooped pattern. They often trap air in the lungs, which results in greater lung volumes in these plots of airflow against volume. The other breathing test pattern is called restriction, and this pattern reflects fibrosis, that is lung scarring. When a person with scarred, inflamed lungs takes a deep breath, they can't get air into their small lungs because they're stretching their scars, but they can get air out quickly. So although textbooks at the time said that bronchiolitis obliterans had an obstructive breathing pattern, we now know that BO can have obstructive, restrictive, or normal breathing tests. This is the microwave popcorn plant at which the 8 former workers worked. Kernel popcorn is delivered to this plant, and workers package it in polyethylene bags and in microwave popcorn bags. Inside the plant, there was a large room with many lines in which a machine operator, shown by the circle, filled microwave bags with popcorn kernels and flavored oil, which came from the holding tanks on the mezzanine above them. The bags were sealed and placed in boxes for shipping in the production area. This large packaging area also had a small quality control room where 3 QC workers popped the bags to test for unpopped kernels and salt content. Here you can see the popcorn being put into the bag by a machine overseen by machine operators on each production line. And this is the mixing room, which opened to the packaging area. For shelf stability in grocery stores, microwave popcorn needs a solid fat with flavorings at room temperature. Artificial butter flavorings have many chemicals in proprietary recipes. The predominant chemical is diacetyl, which is a 4-carbon dicarbonyl. It's the same compound that's found in real butter, but it's much more concentrated. One mixer per shift dumped microfine salt and heated liquid butter flavoring into a heated tank of soybean oil, which was then pumped up to the mezzanine holding tanks which you saw above the packaging lines. The holding tanks fed the heated mixture of oil, flavorings, and salt that was squirted into the microwave bags of kernel popcorn. The Missouri State EIS officer, Joe Malone, and NIOSH EIS officer, Rich Canwall, reported the first hint of risk in the factory. Of the 8 cases among former workers, 4 were mixers of butter flavoring and heated oil. When we went to the factory, we found there was only 1 mixer working on each shift. Obviously, they had very high risk, since we estimated that there had only been about 13 former mixers since 1992, when the first Sentinel case became symptomatic. The other 4 workers worked in microwave packaging, and there were no cases seen among workers who packaged unflavored popcorn or worked in offices or the warehouse. In contrast to the former worker findings, none of the current mixers had abnormalities in our cross-sectional evaluation of 117 workers among the 135 employees. This likely reflects a healthy worker effect, in which ill workers leave employment. Nevertheless, the employees had a burden of respiratory illness compared to the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey of the U.S. population. The prevalences of respiratory symptoms and respiratory diagnoses were 2 to 3 times that expected. About a quarter of the workers had abnormal breathing tests, that is, spirometry. The prevalence of the pattern of spirometry that we thought at the time was characteristic of bronchiolitis obliterans was 3 times that expected, and the abnormality did not respond to asthma medications. 3 workers had severe abnormalities in breathing tests, putting them into the range of the former workers listed for lung transplants. Other screening tests, such as X-rays and a measure of gas exchange, were normal. We concluded that there was a lot of unrecognized work-related lung disease among current workers. We measured the average diacetyl exposures for each job category, and we then estimated cumulative exposure for each worker on the basis of the average exposure and length of time in each job he or she had held. Here you can see that workers in the highest quartile of cumulative exposure had higher proportions of abnormal spirometry than other quartiles. There was an exposure-response relationship between flavoring exposure, as reflected by diacetyl, and risk of abnormality. So collectively, we had satisfied several of the criteria listed by Sir Austin Bradford Hill for a causal relationship between flavoring exposure and occupational lung disease. Exposure preceded the disease in the former Sentinel cases. The magnitude of risk among current workers was high, with never smokers having a 10.8-fold risk of abnormal breathing tests compared to the U.S. population. An exposure-response relationship existed, and alternative explanations were unlikely for a rare disease. In the meantime, our team was investigating other microwave popcorn plants, and 4 of 5 other plants had cases consistent with bronchiolitis obliterans, especially in mixers. This fulfilled the criterion of replication of our findings in other populations. With this documentation that flavoring exposure risk existed, our NIOSH engineers and industrial hygienists helped the plant to control flavoring exposures. The company isolated the mixing room with airlock doors and the mezzanine holding tanks from the packaging area. Flavoring and holding tanks were exhausted, temperatures of heated tanks were lowered, and ventilation for dilution was increased. Flavoring transfers were closed instead of workers having to manually add flavors to the mixing tank, and mixers began wearing supplied air respirators. Exposures to diacetyl decreased. As a result of these interventions over 3 years, average diacetyl concentrations fell on this logarithmic scale for these 3 job categories: mixers, machine operators on the packaging lines, and quality control workers who popped 100 microwave popcorn bags per per shift. Mixer exposures dropped from about 38 parts per million to less than 1 part per million. In packaging and quality control, exposures at our last survey in 2003 were all below detectable limits, below about 0.005 parts per million. Mixers still needed supplied air respiratory protection, in that mixing room concentrations exceeded those associated with prior cases in packaging and quality control. Although no current mixer had abnormal breathing tests in the initial cross-sectional survey, 5 months later, a 23-year-old mixer had had a dramatic fall of 1,300 milliliters in the volume of air that he could blow into a spirometer in the first second, the FEV1. In the second follow-up survey 5 months after that, he had lost an additional 700 milliliters for a total loss of 2 liters in 10 months, and he decided to leave employment at the popcorn plant. His breathing tests then stabilized somewhat over the remaining surveys, but he was left with severe lung disease. This worker demonstrated that frequent medical screening with breathing tests in flavoring-exposed workplaces could identify those with rapid declines in their breathing test measurements, hopefully before workers became disabled. These rapid decliners could be relocated to lower or no exposure positions and also indicated where more protective measures were needed. As flavoring exposures were reduced in this microwave popcorn plant, our medical screening with breathing tests showed that annualized declines in the breathing test results, the forced expiratory volume in 1 second, declined among the 27 workers who participated in all 8 cross-sectional surveys. In 2001, the first year of follow-up, average FEV1 fell by 142 milliliters. In 2002, FEV1 fell in these same individuals by 46 milliliters. In 2003, the third year of follow-up, the FEV1 fall was 22 milliliters, and this last average decline per year is what we would expect in an unexposed population. By reducing flavoring exposures, the company interrupted the average airway damage reflected in breathing test decline in this plant. Of course, medical screening identifies individuals who require secondary prevention by decreasing exposure or medical removal. Ultimately, medical screening and exposure control require standard setting with a permissible exposure limit promulgated by the regulatory agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, in the Department of Labor. With dissemination of the microwave popcorn story, the chest physicians in California reported diagnoses of bronchiolitis obliterans in 2 workers from flavoring manufacturing plants in California in 2004 and 2006. Unlike the microwave popcorn industry exposures, flavoring workers may be exposed to about 2,000 flavoring chemicals in batch operations that differ from hour to hour and from day to day. This variability in chemical exposures makes exposure characterization nearly impossible. However, diacetyl is used to make many flavorings such as nut and fruit flavors. Since flavors are generally regarded as safe to ingest by the Food and Drug Administration, the flavoring industry had not considered chemical breathing hazards, as shown in this picture of a worker weighing a poured ingredient in open containers and no respiratory protection. In response to the case reports, the California Department of Public Health and Cal-OSHA partnered in a unique preventive program for workers in the flavoring industry from 2006 to 2009. 16 companies reported identifiable medical screening data to the health department in exchange for preventive consultation by the Cal-OSHA regulatory agency and avoidance of compliance fines. Thomas Kim, the California EIS officer, analyzed the aggregate breathing tests from the first cross-sectional screening reported by the companies. He showed that the 4 companies using the most diacetyl per year each had 4 cases with abnormal breathing tests consistent with bronchiolitis obliterans because they were unresponsive to asthma medication. In the California flavoring industry, more cases developed during longitudinal screening, and the same four companies with four-person clusters of lung disease had workers with excessive declines in their breathing tests with follow-up medical screening. In both the Sentinel plant and the flavoring plants in California, some cases had onset of chest symptoms 10 years before these investigations. In 1985, NIOSH had investigated a cluster of bronchiolitis obliterans in a flavoring plant making flavors for the baking industry. In 1993 to 1996, Jim Lockey from the University of Cincinnati had studied a cluster of bronchiolitis obliterans in a flavoring plant with which he had a confidentiality agreement. What were the barriers to recognition of the diacetyl risk in the 15 years before our popcorn plant investigation? Well, physicians usually diagnose patients with cough, wheezing, shortness of breath, with common illnesses such as asthma, bronchitis, and chronic obstructive lung disease, the latter especially in people who have ever smoked. Even most chest physicians have never seen a patient with bronchiolitis obliterans, and if so, it was a textbook presentation of an overwhelming noxious exposure, followed by recovery, and then development of untreatable difficulty getting air out on exhaling. Individual cases could only be attributed to preceding exposure if he or she had been healthy before surviving dramatic pulmonary edema following an accident. No one had reported indolent onset of bronchiolitis obliterans from ongoing exposure, with cases occurring one by one over several years. Even for a rare disease, attribution of individual cases to an exposure is not possible without epidemiologic risk factors. And as you know, epi-investigation requires a cluster of disease in a defined population, such as a workforce. The clusters in two flavoring workforces before the microwave popcorn plant investigation were not epidemiologically investigated, but the hundreds or thousands of chemicals in flavoring plants precluded identifying an unknown chemical cause. The 8 Sentinel cases in the microwave popcorn plant investigation occurred in a rural factory outside of Jasper, Missouri. There were 2 chest physicians locally who saw all the cases, referred several of them to national referral centers, which sometimes missed the diagnosis, and knew of their common employment. One of them contacted OSHA, which reported that there were no respiratory hazards in the plant. OSHA enforces regulations, but no regulations exist for unknown hazards. A public health agency would have been a better contact, as known by Dr. Parmet, who contacted the Missouri Department of Health and Social Services. The sanitarian was not likely to know what suspected bronchiolitis obliterans was, and did the right thing calling CDC. Luckily, the Atlanta respondent called NIOSH, and specifically the Division of Respiratory Disease Studies. There we knew that 8 cases in a small food production factory, with 4 severe enough to be listed for lung transplant, was something unknown. We wanted to investigate, but needed a health department invitation, since our only right of entry at NIOSH is a request by 3 current workers, a labor union, or management. We had the tools, questionnaires, breathing tests, chest x-rays, and exposure assessment expertise to conduct on-site characterization of the plant population. We recognized that a population with 26% abnormal breathing tests and excess chest symptoms was anomalous and had ongoing risk. Thus, we could establish epidemiologic risk factors such as diacetyl exposure and rule out smoking as a cause. Compared to flavoring manufacture, we were only dealing with components of butter flavoring, and exposure to flavoring volatiles for specific job categories were the same over an 8-hour shift. Although the predominant volatile was diacetyl, we could only say initially that it was a marker of the causative agent. To fulfill the last of Sir Austin Bradford Hill's criteria for causal inference from epidemiologic associations, we needed to demonstrate biologic plausibility from toxicologic studies. And that is why we turned to Ann Hubbs, who will share an exciting story of her continuing investigations of a brand new area in toxicology. And with that, I'd like to introduce Ann, who is a research veterinary medical officer at NIOSH in Morgantown, West Virginia.
Thank you. So in the Health Effects Laboratory Division, we look at causes of disease very often. And this was not just my work. I'm just up here speaking. So there were many people involved in this work into the biological plausibility from popcorn workers' lung and its molecular mechanisms. So butter flavoring vapors were originally associated with this disease in workers. But we thought the actual cause and not a marker would be diacetyl. Let me explain why. This is a GC mass spec of the vapors. So we're talking the gas phase of artificial butter flavoring. Here we're looking at the abundance of a series of molecules, and as they come off with time from the GC mass spec. And these are the names of some of the many compounds that make up those complex vapors. But we were interested and concerned with diacetyl because, one, it was an agent of unknown toxicity, and we knew the safety or toxicity of some of the others. And the other thing was its chemical structure told us it could be a significant risk. So it was immediately a suspect, and here's why. This is the structure of diacetyl. It's a 4-carbon compound. On each side is a methyl group, something that's not going to be particularly reactive. But in the middle of the molecule are 2 carbonyl carbons. There are double bonds here between carbon and oxygen, and they're in adjacent carbon molecules. And what that allows the electrons to do is to move around between those 2 carbon groups. So I don't like to show diacetyl this way. Let's show it the way the body sees it, with its dancing electrons. So the electrons move around. And in moving around, they can react with other structures, and biological molecules interact with diacetyl. So it would likely be a reactive compound that could be causing problems. But would it target the airways? Because these workers largely had airway disease. So we looked at what happened in the airways of rats that were exposed to butter flavoring vapors or diacetyl. And we saw a common pattern emerge. When they were exposed to butter flavoring vapors or diacetyl, we saw the death of the cells that lined the airways. And so if the exposure was sufficient, there was significant damage. And we also knew, like any other structure, when you damage the lining of an airway, it will scar. Biologists call this fibrosis. We often talk about pulmonary fibrosis when it's out in the deep lung, but the airways can also scar, and that gives us fixed airways disease. What this looks like to someone like me, who is a pathologist, is that instead of this wonderful carpet of epithelium that lines the airway, we instead see in the diacetyl exposed airways that this carpet has been disrupted. And so rather than having intact cells, we see cell loss, and we see the products of cell necrosis and the response to that out here in the lining. And we would expect a scar to develop, and a scarred airway is fixed. Colleagues at the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences and Duke did repeated exposures to diacetyl, and they found that indeed that was the case. So with repeated exposures to diacetyl, and this is an image from the airway of a rat, we see this fibrous connective tissue here that is part of a scar, and in fact this polypoid structure is actually healed back to the airway obstructing it. But it wasn't just diacetyl. It was a related compound that caused similar damage with sufficient exposure. This is another butter flavoring vapor. This is 2,3-pentanedione. And here, this should be an airway, but in fact, this trichrome stain is showing early fibrosis here in what should be the airway passage. And this is very much an obliterative lesion, hence bronchiolitis obliterans. So we have these dancing electrons, and we asked, why is the airway epithelium damaged by diacetyl and 2,3-pentanedione? In its simplest form, it is just that both of these compounds share this reactive alpha dicarbonyl group. And in diacetyl, there's one carbon here, and in 2,3-pentanedione, there are two. So these are extremely similar structures. But what is going on? They're reactive. They're both alpha dicarbonyl compounds. But really importantly, they react with amino acids, the building block of proteins. So go where the data takes you. And the data tells us the hypothesis might have something to do with that, and that protein damage underlies airway epithelial toxicity of diacetyl. So why would we care about protein? Well, either one of them can damage protein function. It's not just they're damaging those proteins, but the proteins don't act right. So colleagues at the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences and Duke University looked at the activity of some representative proteins, enzyme activity, and exposure time in minutes to diacetyl or 2,3-pentanedione. So looking at how much activity was left with time, and in fact, both of them caused loss of protein function. But okay, protein? Really? Why is protein damage important? And that's because protein is what determines everything, for the most part, that happens in the cell. So this is a cell, and we all know genes are important, right? That's why we got the genes we got from our parents, and that is because of DNA. But actually, I'm going to tell you that DNA is mostly important after you're born because it produces protein. So DNA transcribes to RNA, and that's translated into protein. And that's why cells do what cells do, for the most part. But there's another side to proteins. It's not all about your genes and us thinking that DNA is important. Protein quality has to be controlled at the other side, too. We have to have control of the quality of proteins, and that's where research has been exploding in the past few decades. So when a protein is damaged, or if it's a normal protein and it's supposed to end its life, what is supposed to happen is that protein is recognized by a molecule called ubiquitin, sometimes more than one molecule, and mostly at a specific site called K48 ubiquitin. And K48 ubiquitin, sometimes multiple molecules like that, here as little orange balls, the color of butter. They then go to a structure called the proteasome, and there they get recycled. And what ends up happening is you get the amino acids back. What a wonderful system. But if we have too many damaged proteins there, something else can kick in. And that is a process that's mediated by K63-linked ubiquitin. Usually multiple molecules, this time linked as K63 ubiquitin, which actually refers to the lysine group. And then there's another very important protein which is sequestosome 1. Sequestosome 1 makes a scaffold that sequesters those damaged proteins so that they don't have their toxic effects in the cell. So it sequesters them there, and then you got to get rid of them. So you send them to the lysosome. And this is a process called autophagy. And it's also really, really important. It controls getting rid of those toxic proteins you can't get rid of by recycling. And it also has a number of other biological processes. But instead of recycling, it's throwing it out in the trash. So our approach was to look at ubiquitin and autophagy after diacetyl exposure, because diacetyl damages proteins. And here's how. And this is why it's important. Damaged proteins are toxic to cells. Ubiquitin is a central mediator of protein quality control. And the Nobel Prize was awarded for its discovery in 2004. This is very important. And ubiquitin depletion is toxic because you dysregulate all the proteins. The cell doesn't work right. Some proteins live too long. Damaged proteins accumulate. Amino acids are depleted. And ubiquitin identifies proteins that are no longer needed or damaged. And that's the big summary. It's important in controlling lifespan of normal proteins and damaged toxic ones. Proteins are recycled into their constituent amino acids in the proteasome, and in the presence of overwhelming protein damage, ubiquitin can send damaged proteins for destruction in the lysosome as a process known as autophagy, for which the 2016 Nobel Prize was awarded. So when we look at an airway, and in this case we have stained the airway epithelium so that it is green, and you can see the cell junctions here in bright green. And we've also stained for ubiquitin, and you really don't see anything. It's kind of a pink haze because we stained for ubiquitin in red in this control airway from a rat. Actually, this is a mouse. But in the diacetyl exposed airway from a mouse, instead what you see is still the airway epithelium. It's a little damaged and shriveled up here. But what you see in red is that ubiquitin has gathered together in discrete areas of the cell. So we wondered if protein quality control had actually been disrupted. And so we wanted to look at the scaffolding protein, the sequestosome 1, that sequesters those damaged proteins. Maybe it was doing something. And this is, again, the airway of a diacetyl exposed mouse. Here, we've stained in green sequestosome 1. And we're looking at it under green fluorescent light. If we look at this same airway section, this is the lining epithelium in red, this is ubiquitin. Now, if they're both in the same spot, we're going to see red and green at the same time, and that's going to give us yellow. There's the yellow. The little ubiquitin is lining up right along the scaffold in an autophagy-related process. So we wanted to see, hey, what happened to the lysosomes? That's where the ubiquitin is supposed to go in autophagy. And so here's the airway with the lysosomes in green. Again, we've stained ubiquitin in red. And now we're going to look at the lysosome. Should be yellow if the ubiquitin is in the lysosome. Bingo! There it is. We have autophagy. Actually, when we, that being me, microdissected the airways out from the diacetyl exposed mice, and we looked at a Western blot and band intensity by molecular weight, the free ubiquitin is just the little molecules out there before they're complexed with protein. And the process had actually depleted the free ubiquitin in the airway enriched fraction. So there was loss of free ubiquitin, the central mediator of protein quality control in the diacetyl exposed airways. So what do we think is happening to the pathways for proteins damaged by diacetyl? What we believe happens is the protein, when it's been damaged and is now misfolded and damaged and toxic, is recognized by ubiquitin. We probably have some K48 ubiquitin links. We're not quite certain of that yet. But what we know is something goes wrong in terms of this proteasomal process. It appears to have been overwhelmed, or maybe the function has somehow been altered, but it can't keep up with the damaged protein. Instead, the alternate pathway for handling overwhelming damage begins to play a role. And we see a response to overwhelming protein damage with the accumulation of ubiquitin in the scaffolding protein sequestosome 1. And we see its movement to the lysosome. And autophagy taking over, so proteins are going out in the trash and are being damaged. So the mechanisms of flavorings-related lung disease appear to be that butter flavoring vapors damage airway lining. Diacetyl and 2,3-pentanedione are major toxic components of butter flavoring vapors. And if we look at diacetyl itself and the mechanisms of its damage, we know that it damages proteins and that diacetyl inhalation overwhelms the protein quality control in the airway lining. And the data are consistent with protein damage as the fundamental mechanism for flavorings-related lung disease. And we have additional mechanistic studies that are ongoing today. And with that, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Kristen Cummings, who will talk about where this research is going in the field today.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I do have a confession to make. This series is called We Were There, but I wasn't actually there for these early investigations that Drs. Kreis and Hubbs so eloquently described. I joined CDC as an Epidemic Intelligence Service officer in 2005, assigned to NIOSH in Morgantown, West Virginia. My EIS classmates were busy investigating things that CDC was famous for, like outbreaks of measles and fungal keratitis in the US and HIV and malaria globally. I, on the other hand, had been assigned to a group looking at butter. One confused classmate asked, "Are you working on the obesity epidemic?" The idea that butter vapors could pose a health hazard was just not on people's radar. And yet the work that Drs. Kreis and Hubbs and their many colleagues had done made clear that this was an important public health problem. The cluster of lung disease cases at the microwave popcorn plant in Missouri served as a sentinel health event, warning that a larger community was at risk. Initially, that community comprised the former and current workers at the same plant. After all, they had been working in the same environment as the case patients and were also exposed to butter flavorings. And indeed, the investigative team showed that other workers at that plant had been adversely affected by their workplace exposure, some with lung function deficits as severe as those seen in the sentinel cases, as Dr. Kreis described. But this wasn't the only microwave popcorn plant in the country. If workers at one plant were developing lung disease related to butter flavorings, the community at risk must also include workers at other microwave popcorn plants that use butter flavorings. NIOSH investigators conducted extensive evaluations at 5 other microwave popcorn plants, finding workers with lung disease in all but one. This finding indicated that the risk did indeed go beyond the sentinel plant. Exposures to diacetyl associated with disease were as low as 0.02 parts per million or 20 parts per billion, which was much lower than exposures measured in the sentinel plant. The need for respiratory protection and engineering controls to reduce exposures was evident. Of course, microwave popcorn was not the only food product made with butter flavorings. The community at risk potentially included other food production workers, making such things as candy, cookies, and snack foods like potato chips, as well as the workers manufacturing the flavorings themselves. Investigators asked if NIOSH had ever seen cases of lung disease in industries other than microwave popcorn and reviewed the archives containing records of prior investigations. Well, it turns out there really is nothing new under the sun. NIOSH had seen lung disease and flavoring-exposed workers before. In 1985, 15 years before Dr. Kreis and her colleagues were alerted to the cluster of lung disease cases at the Missouri microwave popcorn plant, NIOSH had conducted a health hazard evaluation at a flavoring manufacturing facility. The evaluation was requested by the facility's management after 2 employees developed severe lung disease over a short time period. I think it's worthwhile to spend a moment reviewing these cases, which are now more than 30 years old. The first case occurred in a 28-year-old man who was a non-smoker and without respiratory complaints when he began working in the mixing room in 1983. He noticed the onset of shortness of breath with exertion after 5 months on the job. He was found to have severe airways obstruction that was described as mildly responsive to bronchodilators. He left employment after 1 year. He had no improvement in symptoms or lung function despite treatment with bronchodilators and steroids and cessation of the workplace exposure. Case 2 is remarkably and tragically similar. In 1984, after the worker in Case 1 became too ill to continue working in the mixing room, a 30-year-old healthy man who was also a non-smoker replaced him in that job. He developed shortness of breath 4 months later and was found to have severe airways obstruction, which was described as minimally responsive to bronchodilators. He left employment after just 5 months and, like the worker in Case 1, had no improvement in symptoms or lung function. The NIOSH investigators recognized these cases as bronchiolitis obliterans, and they concluded that they were likely caused by an exposure in the mixing room of the facility. Yet, unlike at the Sentinel microwave popcorn plant, they were unable to pinpoint the cause. It's tempting to attribute this difference to the superior technology for air sampling available to the 21st century team compared to their 20th century counterparts, or perhaps some unique combination of tenacity and brilliance among the more contemporary investigators. They just wouldn't stop until they had identified the culprit. Unfortunately, the best explanation is one that probably plays a greater role in science than we would like to admit, and that's chance. The team investigating the cases of lung disease at the Sentinel microwave popcorn plant was absolutely outstanding in terms of their training, experience, insights, and approach, and they were also extremely lucky. Let me explain what I mean. On the next few slides is a list of ingredients used at the flavoring manufacturing plant, which I've taken from the Health Hazard Evaluation Report. Did anyone spot diacetyl? So it's listed there a couple of times in different forms, along with more than 200 other ingredients. In a batch operation like this one, exposures will vary day to day, even hour to hour, as workers fulfill customer orders that might range from essence of strawberry to steak flavor. In contrast, here is an exhaustive list of the ingredients used to make microwave popcorn. The process was the same from day to day, hour to hour. Whereas the investigators at the flavoring plant in 1985 were searching for the proverbial needle in a haystack, the investigators at the microwave popcorn plant in 2000 were dealing with just a handful of ingredients and a far more predictable exposure profile, meaning that they were in a much better position to zero in on the cause of the lung disease among workers. Identifying the cause meant that the recommendations for worker protection could be targeted to address diacetyl's specific characteristics. For instance, in 1985, the investigators recommended controls aimed at reducing exposures to dust, because they noticed that the mixing room was very dusty. Yet such controls would not necessarily be effective against diacetyl, which is a volatile organic compound rather than a dust. 15 years later, investigators at the microwave popcorn plant could recommend controls specific to diacetyl, which were likely to be more effective. Well, by 2007, the issue of lung disease related to diacetyl is picking up traction. As often happens when an occupational illness is identified, members of the general public began to ask if they were at risk. Would popping microwave popcorn at home before watching a movie or the Super Bowl cause irreversible lung damage? NIOSH and other experts emphasized that all known cases had occurred in workers who had been exposed repeatedly and on a daily basis to relatively high levels of diacetyl. The exposures at home were simply not comparable. And then a physician contacted the Food and Drug Administration to report a possible consumer case. The case reported to the FDA was that of a 53-year-old man who worked in sales. An exhaustive clinical evaluation turned up no explanation for his disease. It would have likely been tossed in the idiopathic basket had his physician not asked a seemingly odd question: "Do you by any chance like microwave popcorn?" His response was something along the lines of, "How did you know that? I'm Mr. Popcorn." And he went on to describe a decade-long habit of consuming multiple bags per day and a fondness for inhaling the vapors after opening each bag. The press jumped on the story, with major outlets like the New York Times, Reuters, and the big television networks running stories. Their headlines varied from fairly staid to somewhat sensational, but the upshot was the same. A frightening disease that had been limited to workers was now a threat to the general public. The next day, industry leaders, collectively responsible for 80% of all microwave popcorn sales in the U.S., announced that they were removing diacetyl from their recipes for butter-flavored microwave popcorn. Although there were comments that these plans had been in progress for months, the timing of the announcement suggested that the need to address perceptions of consumer risk played at least some role in motivating implementation. As it turns out, there has not been a widespread outbreak of lung disease in consumers, and it's likely that the risk to the general public is extremely low. Mr. Popcorn was not the tip of an iceberg. But whether undertaken for workers, the general public, or both, this voluntary move by the industry was welcome. After all, it was consistent with the hierarchy of controls, a tenet of occupational health that emphasizes the effectiveness of steps such as elimination and substitution of a hazard over less effective measures like administrative controls and personal protective equipment, which put the burden of exposure reduction on the worker. Getting rid of diacetyl and replacing it with something else seemed like the right thing to do. At this point, our work shifted from a focus on diacetyl to broader questions about the inhalational risk of food flavoring chemicals more generally. We would learn that substitution does not always resolve an occupational hazard, and that the presence of one particular inhalational hazard in a workplace does not preclude the existence of others. In a sense, the community at risk was the same, but the exposures were changing. In 2008, I was the medical officer for a health hazard evaluation at a bakery mix manufacturing facility. Workers combined ingredients to produce dry bakery mixes such as buttermilk pancake mix. Ingredients included liquid butter flavors, which were added to large mixing tanks as pictured here. The management informed us that they had asked their suppliers to remove all diacetyl from their flavorings. When we asked what diacetyl had been replaced by, they replied that they didn't know. As we would learn, flavoring manufacturers used related alpha diketones with additional carbon groups in place of diacetyl, and you heard a little bit about this from Dr. Hubbs. As you can see here, diacetyl is also known as 2,3-butane-dione. The substitutes had the same chemical structure but a longer tail. So 2,3-pentane-dione had one extra carbon group, 2,3-hexane-dione, 2 extra carbon groups, and 2,3-heptane-dione, 3 extra carbon groups. Well, my colleagues in the laboratory found that the predominant ingredient in the new flavoring was 2,3-pentane-dione. Exposures to 2,3-pentane-dione at this bakery mix facility were as high as 91 parts per billion. At the time, we didn't know whether 2,3-pentane-dione was toxic, and if so, what a safe level would be. But we were concerned about the structural similarities between diacetyl and 2,3-pentane-dione and the measured exposures, which were comparable to the diacetyl exposures that had been associated with disease in the microwave popcorn industry. These findings stimulated the subsequent experimental work that Dr. Hubbs described, confirming that 2,3-pentane-dione is also a respiratory toxin. Well, in 2011, I led a health hazard evaluation at a large flavoring manufacturing facility that was phasing out use of diacetyl. Again, we found that the predominant substitute was 2,3-pentane-dione. Yet it was notable that we detected 2,3-pentane-dione in a minority of air samples. At least during our visit, most workers were not being exposed to diacetyl or its substitute. But that didn't mean that they didn't have flavoring chemical exposures. These photos show the research and development area on the left and the samples preparation area on the right. The many bottles representing different flavoring chemicals are evident in each photo. And this is really the 1985 list of ingredients in pictorial form. This was clearly a very complex environment where workers were potentially exposed to hundreds of flavoring chemicals, most of which have poorly characterized inhalational toxicity. So we offered questionnaire and lung function testing to the current workers, who numbered about 400. We found that participants with higher flavoring chemical exposure from longer plant tenure or more time spent in production areas had significantly more respiratory symptoms and lower lung function than their coworkers. and we urged a proactive approach that acknowledged that in flavoring manufacture, diacetyl and its substitutes were unlikely to be the only inhalational hazard. In the absence of certainty, overall exposure reduction and medical surveillance are prudent. More recently, we published a summary of NIOSH health hazard evaluations of microwave popcorn in flavoring manufacturing facilities. From 2000 to 2012, just over 1,400 workers from 9 facilities in 8 states participated in NIOSH medical evaluations, including questionnaire and spirometry testing. We examined respiratory abnormalities using several different mutually exclusive case definitions. So the most stringent was pathologist reported, and just 4 workers, or 0.3% of all participants, met a biopsy-based definition of bronchiolitis obliterans. The next 2 definitions were probable and possible, and they were defined by abnormal lung function. Together, they accounted for about 20% of the participants, which is about twice as high a prevalence of abnormal lung function as we would expect to find. Finally, symptoms only referred to participants with normal lung function but who reported cough or shortness of breath. And over 400, or about 29%, met this definition, which is also roughly twice expected. So we concluded that the burden of respiratory abnormalities in these workers indicates flavoring-related health effects that go far beyond the few biopsy-proven cases of disease. Well, in 2013, our attention turned to the risk of flavoring-related lung disease in the coffee industry. We reported 2 cases of bronchiolitis obliterans, which is also called obliterative bronchiolitis, among workers at a coffee facility in Texas. 5 clinical cases would ultimately be diagnosed. And this facility roasted coffee beans, producing both unflavored and flavored coffee. A subsequent health hazard evaluation at the facility found that diacetyl and 2,3-pentanedione levels were elevated in the flavoring room, where flavors such as vanilla and hazelnut were added to roasted coffee. Exposures were also elevated in the separate grinding and packaging room, where unflavored coffee was produced. The source was not the flavoring room itself. It had separate ventilation and was under negative pressure compared to the rest of the plant. So as it turns out, roasting and grinding unflavored coffee beans releases these volatile organic compounds, meaning that the health risk was not necessarily limited to areas where flavorings were used. That being said, all of the clinical cases at this facility occurred in workers who had spent at least some of their employment in the flavoring room, so it was not possible to attribute any of the cases to unflavored coffee alone. The risk to workers of roasting and grinding unflavored coffee is an area of ongoing investigation for NIOSH. Well, one of NIOSH's responsibilities is to develop recommended exposure limits for specific substances, which OSHA takes into consideration when setting legally binding permissible exposure limits. In 2016, NIOSH released its criteria for a recommended standard for diacetyl and 2,3-pentanedione, setting its recommended exposure limits at 5 parts per billion and 9.3 parts per billion, respectively. The document included recommendations for engineering controls, respiratory protection, hazard communication, and periodic medical surveillance of exposed workers. To date, federal OSHA has not issued a permissible exposure limit, although Cal OSHA in California issued a diacetyl standard in 2010. I mentioned hazard communication. One of the primary means of communicating hazards to workers is the safety data sheet. Yet these may not always include information about diacetyl and its substitutes. You recall that when we asked the management of the bakery mix facility what had been substituted for diacetyl in their diacetyl-free flavorings, they didn't know. That was in part because it hadn't been declared on the safety data sheet, where constituents may be omitted if found in small amounts or considered proprietary. Recently, we looked at 26 flavorings used at 2 coffee facilities to compare what was included in the safety data sheet versus what was actually in the flavoring. We found that none of these safety data sheets listed diacetyl, although it was in 81% of the samples. Similarly, none listed 2,3-pentanedione, although it was in 58% of the samples. While we can't be certain why this discrepancy existed, we did note that all of the safety data sheets contained trade secret designations. So under these circumstances, we concluded that a precautionary approach is warranted when working with flavorings, including exposure monitoring and exposure reduction strategies. Well, as you might imagine, the issue of flavorings and lung disease took on a litigious tone, with workers and consumers suing employers, manufacturers, and even grocers, and in one difficult episode, a manufacturer suing NIOSH and NIOSH employees. Information that became available during tort proceedings shed light on why the epidemic in the microwave popcorn industry occurred when it did. In the 1990s, in the context of an ever-increasing national waistline, the market for low-fat snacks was also growing. To create low-fat popcorn, it's necessary to lower the oil content, which negatively affects the taste. To make up for the missing oil, manufacturers increased the diacetyl content of the butter flavorings and added more butter flavoring to their recipes, exposing workers to far greater concentrations of diacetyl than ever before. So to the extent that flavoring lung disease came to light because of the low-fat food craze, my EIS classmate had been right. I was working on the obesity epidemic and getting a first-hand introduction to the law of unintended consequences. I played a small part in this incredible story. I've tried throughout the presentation to include the names of authors in order to acknowledge the many people whose scientific contributions were so critical. Yet the scientists alone could not do this work without an incredible support team, from the medical, industrial hygiene, and laboratory technicians who collected the data to the travel preparers who made sure we got there and back on so many field studies. Beyond those in the Respiratory Health Division, I want to recognize the invaluable contributions of our colleagues in other NIOSH divisions and offices, in state and local health departments across the country, and in state and federal OSHA sites. I also want to acknowledge the astute clinicians who recognized that their patients had something more than routine asthma or chronic obstructive lung disease and took the time to reach out to public health authorities. And of course, this work could not have been succeeded without the participation of workers, the support of labor unions where they existed, and the cooperation of management and industry who are ultimately in the position to implement the recommendations we made to protect their workers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we can now take questions. Anne.
Thanks for just a beautiful set of investigations and stories and incredible presentations. The comment that it's okay to eat these things but not to inhale them, I guess, raises the question about vaping and whether you have information about particular chemicals that are used in flavoring for e-cigarettes or for vaping that cause concerns for you, or whether there's a science of those exposures yet.
Do you want to take that?
NIOSH participated in the original workshop that was done by the FDA when they were determining whether or not they wanted to regulate the e-cigarettes. And we did present data on diacetyl and 2,3-pentanedione there, and that is the extent to which we have been involved, because that is more an FDA issue and an indoor air pollution issue, which we've been less involved in. However, there have been studies that were done, for instance, by Joseph Allen, I think was one of the first people to publish on the composition. Dr. Farsalinos in Greece has also published on the issue, and there is significant diacetyl concentration, or at least was, in those original e-cigarette vape liquids, and it is a concern. I don't know how much regulation has occurred, but one of the huge concerns is the vaping of e-cigarette liquids that do contain diacetyl intentionally bypasses the nose and would deliver those alpha dicarbonyl compounds to the deep lung. So it is a concern for the most part in terms of the intentional inhaling of them. That's more of an FDA issue, so we have not particularly gone there.
But I think the other comment I would make is that inhalation toxicology is very expensive and is not routine. And so the designation by the Food and Drug Administration that flavorings that are currently in commerce are generally regarded as safe is a label the FDA uses, and yet that label is really is derived from the industry and industry experts. It does not reflect toxicologic testing.
The trade group, Flavoring and Extract Manufacturers Association, has actually made a public statement regarding that. Their designation by FEMA, and that's the flavoring FEMA, not the other one, is intended to mean that the substance is safe to eat. There is a lot of controversy because I think the wording as it was defined is as intended to be used. And, if you ask some people, it's intended that the worker makes it in terms of the worker issue. But when it comes to the flavors that people are vaping in e-cigarettes, that is an intended use, and FEMA does not approve that process.
Just in follow-up, I thought, you're sort of looking through the biologic plausibility was so beautiful. And I think you made the case for being able to predict that certain chemicals are likely to be problematic. I wonder whether the industry has sort of absorbed that in their, research for better flavoring.
I don't know where they're at in regards to that. That is part of where we are at, is can we predict which ones are going to be a hazard? And also, do we go beyond the compounds that are directly reactive to those that may be metabolized within the airway epithelium to target that same ubiquitin proteasome pathway? And so that is ongoing research.
Dr. Bryson?
Thank you again for a very great series of talks. I was wondering if you're in a position to comment on what the manufacturers knew, when they knew it, and what did they communicate to the producers of butter-flavored products, and what responsibility they have to do some product stewardship, perhaps, and if they weren't doing that well in the past, are they doing it better now?
I'll start on that. The Flavoring and Extract Manufacturers Association has a lot of proprietary data from chemical manufacturers. And in the early 1990s, one of the manufacturers of Diacetyl actually conducted toxicologic studies in rodents and noted that the rodents had respiratory disease. And that was reported to the Flavoring and Extract Manufacturers Association in an unpublished monograph. We became aware that such a monograph existed, but that it was considered confidential in the courts. And we eventually contacted the medical director of that chemical manufacturer, who sent us the entire monograph, and we had been provided only the first 3 pages by the Flavoring and Extract Manufacturers Association, withholding the animal studies that basically documented that there was a respiratory hazard. So, I think that work had been done in Germany, and I don't know what the legal responsibilities would have been, but it was an international chemical company. With respect to the buttermilk bakery mix investigation that Kristen described and was involved in, the baking mix company was precluded in their contractual obligation to the flavoring suppliers from reverse engineering to find out what was in the flavoring. And so the only way that they found out was because of NIOSH testing and telling them what was in their flavoring that they had bought. So the whole trade secret regulations are very difficult from a public health point of view. The other point I would make is that since the industry often has much better information than the academic community or government agencies, and since even the 1985 outbreak in the flavoring company supplying flavored materials to the baking industry, those cases did come to litigation. We didn't know that, of course, at the time. But one of the thoughts that I had was maybe there ought to be surveillance of litigated cases which would allow public health agencies to know about what might be arising.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. Maybe you have some thoughts. It was Dr. Cummings. It was very interesting to see that the individual consumer case had such prompt response when you think about sort of the industry research and very careful work. And I think you have this double-edged sword that industrial exposure is likely to be higher and likely to be a cleaner case for exposure outcome, but has its own set of complexity in terms of the effectors to change versus consumer concern and reputation and credibility and what really makes us try to lower risk, or companies want to lower risk rapidly. It made me wonder how closely NIOSH works with other parts of CDC or with others who are engaged in the same exposures, but not for the workplace exposures, whether we have opportunities for more collective impact with that kind of collaboration.
I would agree with you that it does seem like the level of evidence needed for action is different for workers versus the public, and I do wonder if Kay's paper in the New England Journal in 2002 that showed there was an association with diacetyl but couldn't say it was diacetyl, but you saw that beautiful dose response graph. Had that been in consumers, we might have seen a different response. It may not have taken 5 years as it did to have the industry announce that they were removing diacetyl. In terms of collaboration with other groups at CDC, I mean, certainly NIOSH is open to that and is always looking for opportunities to collaborate.
Attributed that to the cases you have seen over the past years?
There hasn't been continuing surveillance. I mean, we did surveillance in the Sentinel plant for almost 3 years, but we have little information about what's happened after we left. One of the issues that was very clear in California was when Cal OSHA and the health department in California asked for voluntary cooperation of flavoring industry companies to surveil their workforce. Only about one of the commercial suppliers of spirometry had adequate quality spirometry. And it's not difficult to do spirometry, but quality control is really necessary. And it was clear from looking at the physicians signing spirometry reports that they had no idea even what was a completely unphysiologic response. So I think industry across the country has probably not had the benefit of good surveillance because it isn't available from the private sector. And that's
another challenge is that many of these workforces have high turnover. So particularly in the coffee industry that we've been studying more recently, the average tenure when we ask how long have you worked at this plant is often less than a year or two. So in order to follow the population over time, you'd have to try to track down people who might be pretty transient. So that's another challenge.
Sorry, and just to follow up, did the plant implement any engineering controls or have their workers use respirators? Can you comment briefly on that side of the study?
Well, certainly in the Sentinel plant, we worked with them to implement the controls. As industry as service jobs have replaced industrial jobs in this country, the availability of industrial engineering has gone down markedly, and we really, and we saw evidence of that even in the Sentinel plant when we told them that they had to exhaust their tanks that held heated flavorings. On the mezzanine, they exhausted them into the general plant air, which at the time was common to the packaging area. And when we came and said, oh, well, you've exhausted them, but you've exhausted them to create a worse situation, it was only then that those got exhausted to the outdoor air. So, I think it's challenging, and in the absence of regulation and enforcement, I suspect we have a whole bunch of plants across the country that are still producing these cases.
So I wonder if you considered or thought about whether there's other lung disease that might be present amongst the people who don't respond over long term. Is it possible that there could be some cancer risk over many years of exposure, short of getting a obliterans type condition?
The National Toxicology Program has recently completed lifetime carcinogenicity studies in mice and in rats, and they did have limited evidence, or it may have been equivocal evidence, of carcinogenicity from diacetyl. And I don't remember the actual numbers. They were respiratory tract adenocarcinomas, as I recall, of the nose, which in the rodent absorbs a lot of these things. And it may have been of the lung as well. Nose often having the same cell type of origin as the human lung does. And because of dosimetry, maybe the target in rodents. But the workplace data, we don't yet have human data. And but it doesn't appear to be a powerful carcinogen due to the nature of how it kills cells. I would expect it to be a powerful promoter, but that work has not been done. That's just a hypothesis.
Yeah, I would consider that similar to asbestos, the smoking exposure interaction might be critical.
Yeah, that kind of interaction is what one would predict, because the cells are not going to have their normal defenses, and once they're induced, they're going to proliferate and fix any genetic damage done by a co-carcinogen. But those studies have not been done. That is a hypothesis.
Can you clarify with the biologic plausibility why you think the disease continues to get worse after they're out of the plants?
There's actually not much evidence that there's progression after exposure ceases, at least after about 2 years. I mean, many of the clinical cases had horrible coughs for about 2 years until after they left the plant, and then their cough resolved somewhat, but their shortness of breath, persisted. But in general, I think that the reason many of these cases have not come to lung transplant is that they have a very different natural history than people with emphysema, for example, who are put on lung transplant lists. And at equivalent pulmonary function deficits, the flavoring-related cases, seem to not progress, which is not the case with smoking-related lung disease.
From a point of view of individuals entering the practice of public health today, it's a lot of good lessons in what you were presenting. The things that you observed, the tools that we had, the insights we had at hand, going back to the 1985 study, which was, as you noted, many ingredients, only a couple limited cases. And I think some of the rules of thumb that you were basically presenting to people were think about the way that industry is changing, consider the way that use of materials is changing, perhaps looking at the coffee industry today with so many small packaging and formulating companies coming into play. I think these are some questions that everyone could keep in mind as they either practice within formal public health or get trained at universities to go into business, or even through schools to educate students better so that when they go into the workforce, they're recognizing some of these situations that have gone way beyond control before they're fully recognized and protection is provided. So thanks for the recapping the history, and I think especially emerging manufacturing and the changing workforce across the world, also climate change and how that changes the conditions of exposure. And so thank you again.
Thank you, Mark. Are there any other questions from Envision or from the audience? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.